You are standing at the edge of something, whether you realize it or not. It is December 2025. The calendar says another year is about to end, but the atmosphere tells a different story. There is a quiet pressure in the air, a sense that the world you woke up to a decade ago is no longer the same world you are standing in now. Headlines scroll past with a strange familiarity. Economic strain, political fractures, storms that refuse to follow old patterns, heat where cold once ruled, floods where land once felt permanent. Nothing feels isolated anymore. Every event seems to echo another, as if reality itself is tightening into a single, unavoidable narrative. Pause for a moment and look around you. Not just at the news, but at conversations, at the way people speak about the future. Notice how often the word normal is used in the past tense. Notice how plans feel provisional, how certainty has become fragile. This is not panic yet. It is something subtler. A collective intuition that a chapter is closing, even if no one can quite explain why. This feeling is not new. Nearly a century ago, long before satellites tracked storms in real time, long before algorithms predicted market behavior, a man in Virginia Beach described this exact sensation. He did not call it chaos. He did not frame it as punishment. He spoke of it as a threshold. A moment when accumulated pressures finally surface, when systems built on imbalance can no longer pretend to hold. You are not hearing this story by accident, and you are not feeling this shift because you are unusually sensitive. Entire civilizations have experienced this sensation before, right before transformation. History tends to whisper before it speaks, and then it speaks before it breaks. December 2025 feels like a whisper that has grown too loud to ignore. Look at the year itself. The language of crisis has become routine. Weather maps glow with unnatural colors, reds and purples where soft blues once lived. Earthquakes are reported with less surprise than they once were. Political alliances strain under pressures they were never designed to hold. Technology advances faster than the ethics meant to guide it. And beneath all of this runs a low, constant hum. A question no one asks directly, but everyone feels. How much longer can this continue? This is where Edgar Cayce enters the story, but not yet as a prophet. First, as a witness, because Cayce did not begin his work by predicting disasters or drawing maps of destruction. He began by observing patterns. Patterns in human behavior, in natural cycles, in the rise and fall of civilizations. He understood something modern culture often forgets: that history is not linear. It is rhythmic. As December 2025 approaches its final days, the rhythm feels familiar to those who study the past deeply enough. The late stages of great empires always feel like this. Confidence on the surface, exhaustion underneath, innovation paired with moral confusion, enormous wealth existing beside deep insecurity, the sense that the old rules still apply, even as evidence mounts that they no longer do. What makes this moment different is not just scale, but synchronization. In the past, collapse or transformation happened region by region. Now, events resonate globally. A tremor in one system ripples through many others. Financial markets respond to weather. Politics reacts to energy shortages. Social stability bends under environmental stress. Everything is connected, and that interconnectedness amplifies every imbalance. This is why December 2025 matters in this story. Not because something dramatic must happen on a specific day, but because it represents a convergence. A point where long-term trends overlap so precisely that change becomes inevitable. Cayce spoke about such moments as pressure points in time, when the future narrows into a limited set of outcomes. If you feel a strange pull towards this conversation, it may be because your own experience mirrors this convergence. Many people describe 2025 as the year when denial finally became uncomfortable. The year when pretending everything would simply stabilize required more effort than admitting something deeper was unfolding. You may not know what is coming, but you sense that the old explanations no longer satisfy. Cayce warned that humanity often waits for spectacle to validate intuition. A single dramatic event, a clear breaking point, but thresholds rarely announce themselves with fireworks. They announce themselves with unease, with repetition, with patterns that feel too aligned to dismiss as coincidence. December 2025 is heavy with those patterns. This is not a message of doom. It is a message of awareness. Every transformation in human history has been preceded by a similar feeling, a quiet knowing that the story is about to turn. Those who ignored it were caught off guard. Those who recognized it early had time to adjust, not just physically, but inwardly. The danger of this moment is not what might happen next. The danger is sleepwalking through it, clinging to outdated assumptions while the ground beneath them shifts. Cayce believed that the greatest crises occur not when systems fail, but when people refuse to acknowledge that they already are. As December 2025 draws to a close, you are not being asked to panic. You are being invited to notice, to recognize that the world's instability is not random and that your unease is not weakness, it is perception. The same perception that has guided humanity through countless transitions before, when old worlds dissolved and new ones quietly took shape beneath the surface. This threshold is not the end of the story. It is the point where the story demands attention. And to understand why this moment feels so charged, you must understand the man who described it long before you were born, and how he claimed to see not just events, but the structure of time itself. To understand why Edgar Cayce's words feel uncomfortably relevant now, you first have to step away from the image most people carry of a prophet. Cayce did not stand on stages. He did not thunder warnings to crowds. He rarely spoke about the future while awake at all. His most extraordinary work happened when he was silent, lying still, eyes closed, breathing slowed to a rhythm that seemed almost practiced, as if his body knew a doorway his conscious mind could not use. In the early 20th century, Cayce was known primarily as a healer. People came to him with illnesses doctors could not explain, and while in a deep sleep-like trance, he would describe conditions in precise anatomical language, often using medical terms he did not consciously know. These sessions were documented, transcribed, and cross-checked. Time and again, they worked. That alone would have been enough to make him a historical anomaly. But something else kept happening. While answering questions about the body, Cayce would drift into answers about the world, about history, about the future, about forces shaping human civilization beyond politics or economics. When pressed on how he accessed this information, he used a phrase borrowed from ancient traditions: the Akashic records, a kind of universal archive where every thought, action, and event exists simultaneously, outside the illusion of linear time. To Cayce, time was not a straight line. It was layered. The past was not gone, the future not unwritten. All of it existed, and human consciousness simply moved through it like a reader turning pages. When he entered trance, he believed he wasn't predicting anything. He was observing probabilities already set in motion. This distinction matters. Predictions imply guesswork. Cayce rejected that idea entirely. He insisted that what he saw were outcomes shaped by accumulated choices. Change the choices, and the outcome could shift. But ignore them long enough, and the outcome hardens into inevitability. This is why so many of his timelines confused later generations. People wanted dates, years circled on calendars, moments to anticipate or dismiss. Cayce resisted that framing. When he did mention years, they were often misunderstood as deadlines rather than markers of process. 1998, 2012, dates that came and went without the dramatic collapse many expected. But Cayce never said the change would be instantaneous. He described slow build-ups, pressure accumulating beneath the surface until visible effects could no longer be delayed. What people missed was that those dates marked internal shifts, not external spectacles. Adjustments in energy, in collective direction, in the relationship between humanity and the planet. Now, in the convergence of 2025 and 2026, those misunderstood timelines begin to align, not as isolated prophecies, but as parts of a longer arc. The world did not end in 1998 or 2012. It changed course. Subtly at first, then faster. The acceleration you feel now is the result of decades of deferred consequences finally arriving together. Cayce himself was deeply uncomfortable with the attention his future-oriented readings received. He warned repeatedly that people should not become obsessed with catastrophe. Fear, he believed, distorted perception and attracted the very outcomes people hoped to avoid. Yet he also refused to soften what he saw, especially when it came to what he called the earth changes. What makes Cayce unusual among prophetic figures is not just accuracy, but consistency. His worldview did not shift with politics or popularity. Whether speaking about ancient Atlantis or 20th century America, his framework remained the same. Consciousness precedes form, and imbalance demands correction. He described Earth not as a passive stage for human activity, but as a living system responding intelligently to stress. When asked why certain regions would experience upheaval, he did not cite divine punishment. He spoke of resonance. Areas where exploitation, excess, or denial had reached extremes created energetic instability that eventually expressed itself physically. This idea placed responsibility back onto humanity, not onto fate. Cayce believed the future was not something that happened to us, but something we participated in creating, moment by moment. That participation did not end with technology or policy. It extended into belief, intention, and awareness. By the time of his death in 1945, Cayce had left behind thousands of recorded readings. Many were sealed, archived, or quietly ignored. The world was eager to rebuild after war, not to contemplate planetary upheaval or spiritual reckoning, but the records remained, waiting. What brings them back now is not nostalgia or mysticism. It is pattern recognition. The same geological instabilities he described are being monitored today. The same societal fractures he warned about are visible across continents. The same moral dilemmas, power without wisdom, technology without restraint, echo the stories he told of earlier civilizations that rose too quickly and fell too hard. If Cayce were alive today, he likely would not frame 2026 as a warning meant to frighten. He would frame it as a checkpoint, a moment when the accumulated momentum of choices becomes visible, where denial becomes impossible and adjustment becomes necessary. This is why his story matters now. Not because he offers certainty, but because he offers context. He reminds us that what feels unprecedented has happened before, in different forms, under different names, and that the most dangerous response is not fear, but unconsciousness. As you move deeper into this narrative, keep this in mind. Cayce did not see humanity as doomed. He saw it as tested. Tested on whether it could recognize a threshold while standing on it, and whether it could respond with awareness rather than reflex. Because what comes next in his readings is not speculation. It is a description of a planet beginning to speak back, and a civilization forced to decide whether it is listening. Skepticism is natural when someone claims to see beyond time. Cayce understood that better than most. He often said that no one should believe his words simply because they sounded profound or mysterious. Instead, he invited people to examine the record. Not the interpretations, but the outcomes. Because in his view, truth left fingerprints. One of the earliest moments those fingerprints became impossible to ignore came at the end of the 1920s. The world was intoxicated with confidence. Markets soared, wealth seemed endless, and the idea of collapse felt almost insulting. In that atmosphere, Cayce spoke of a coming financial bloodletting. He described a sudden reversal, a shattering of illusions, a period when the structures people trusted most would reveal how fragile they truly were. Months later, Wall Street collapsed, and the Great Depression reshaped global history. That pattern repeated. As Europe staggered toward another war, Cayce spoke of a rising force driven by wounded pride and authoritarian ambition. He described the expansion and eventual defeat of Axis powers, not in poetic metaphor, but with unnerving specificity. He spoke of timelines, of beginnings and endings, of devastation followed by reconstruction. When the war ended almost exactly as he had outlined, his reputation quietly grew among those paying attention. He went further. He described the deaths of American presidents before they occurred, not as assassinations to fear, but as nodes in larger cycles of national karma. He spoke of ancient manuscripts hidden near the Dead Sea long before their discovery, explaining not just that they would be found, but where. When the scrolls were unearthed decades later, scholars were stunned not only by their existence, but by the precision of the location he had described. Then there were the technologies. At a time when atomic power belonged to speculative fiction, Cayce spoke of energy locked within matter itself. He mentioned focused beams of light capable of cutting and transmitting information, concepts that would later resemble lasers. These were not the ramblings of a man influenced by science headlines. Many of these ideas had no public precedent when he described them. Individually, any one of these predictions could be dismissed as coincidence. Collectively, they form a pattern that is much harder to ignore, especially because Cayce did not cherry-pick his successes. Every reading was documented, including those that never came to pass or were conditional upon human choice. This transparency is part of what gives his record weight. What matters now is not admiration for past accuracy. It is what that accuracy implies about what comes next. Because the same source that described economic collapse, world war, and hidden texts also spoke about a period of profound planetary transformation. And those readings were not framed as distant myths. They were anchored to an era Cayce described as technologically advanced, globally connected, and spiritually distracted. Sound familiar? Cayce warned that when technology outpaces wisdom, civilizations destabilize themselves. He described societies that mastered powerful tools but failed to understand the responsibility that came with them. The result was not immediate annihilation, but gradual disconnection, followed by sudden correction. The echoes of Atlantis appear here, not as fantasy, but as warning. The Atlantis story in Cayce's work is not about lost continents alone. It is about lost balance. He described a civilization that harnessed enormous energy, both physical and mental, and used it to manipulate matter, weather, and even consciousness. For a time, it appeared unstoppable. Then internal division, misuse of power, and disregard for natural law triggered its collapse. Cayce believed humanity did not leave that lesson behind. He believed many souls alive today lived through that era, and that modern civilization represents a second attempt. New names, new technologies, same test. The proof of this cycle, he argued, was written not just in myth, but in geology and memory. This is where skepticism often hardens into discomfort, because accepting Cayce's accuracy in the past invites an unsettling question. If he was right before, what happens if he is right again? The temptation is to treat his future-oriented readings as exaggerations, metaphors meant to provoke reflection rather than describe events. Cayce himself resisted literalism, but he also resisted dismissal. He insisted that Earth changes were not symbolic. They were physical responses to long-term imbalance. What gives this moment its weight is not fear of disaster, but convergence. Geological data now confirms increasing instability in tectonic systems Cayce highlighted. Climate patterns are shifting faster than historical models predicted. Social and economic systems show stress fractures that mirror those preceding past collapses. The validation loop closes quietly here. Past accuracy opens the door. Present conditions step through it. The future, once abstract, begins to feel uncomfortably close. Cayce did not claim certainty in the sense of fate. He spoke of probability, of momentum. Like a train gathering speed, choices compound until stopping requires more than intention. It requires awareness and action at a scale humanity has rarely demonstrated. This is the uncomfortable legacy of his predictions. They do not allow passive fascination. They demand response. Not preparation in the form of hoarding or hiding, but preparation of perspective. Because if the same voice that foresaw economic collapse, global war, and ancient discoveries also foresaw a tipping point in Earth's behavior, then ignoring it is not skepticism. It is denial. And denial, Cayce warned, is often the final luxury of civilizations standing on the edge of transformation. At the center of Edgar Cayce's most unsettling readings is an idea modern culture still struggles to accept. The Earth is not passive. It is not a backdrop. It is not an object waiting to be acted upon. Cayce spoke of the planet as a living system with memory, responsiveness, and a capacity to correct imbalance when stress exceeds tolerance. He called this process the Earth changes, and he warned that misunderstanding it would lead humanity to fear the very mechanism designed to restore balance. In Cayce's view, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, floods, and extreme weather were not random disasters and not divine punishments. They were symptoms, reactions. Just as a fever signals infection, these events signaled accumulated strain within the planetary system. Human activity, especially when driven by greed, exploitation, and disregard for natural rhythms, generated energetic distortion. Over time, that distortion demanded release. This reframing changes everything. If disasters are attacks, the natural response is defense. If they are corrections, the appropriate response is alignment. Cayce insisted that the Earth does not turn against humanity. It reacts to humanity, and reaction, once triggered, follows laws far older than politics or technology. He described tectonic plates not just as geological structures, but as pressure valves. Regions with long histories of energetic imbalance would experience physical instability first. This is why his readings focused so heavily on coastlines and fault zones, not because they were cursed, but because they carried the greatest accumulated stress. The western edge of the United States featured prominently in these visions. Cayce spoke of fragmentation along the Pacific coast, of land breaking apart rather than simply shaking. Los Angeles, San Francisco, and surrounding regions were described as areas where change would come early. He linked this not only to fault lines, but to ancient history. He claimed the region sat atop remnants of Lemuria, a prehistoric civilization whose unresolved energetic imprint still influenced the land. To modern ears, this sounds symbolic at best. But Cayce treated it literally. He believed land retained memory, that places where advanced societies once misused power remained sensitive to similar patterns repeating. The Ring of Fire, he said, would act as a trigger system. Increased volcanic and seismic activity around the Pacific would signal that broader changes were underway, cascading rather than isolated. As the focus moved eastward, his descriptions shifted. The Atlantic coast, particularly New York, appeared in his readings not as an epicenter of immediate destruction, but as a symbol. Cayce spoke of sudden transformation, of water reclaiming land in moments rather than centuries. Coastlines would redraw themselves. Financial and political centers built on assumed permanence would confront how temporary those assumptions truly were. Europe's future, in his vision, was equally unsettling. He described northern regions sinking while southern areas rose. Scandinavia, the British Isles, and parts of northern Europe would experience profound reshaping as ice melt altered the planet's balance. This was not portrayed as punishment, but as redistribution. When mass shifts, stability follows different rules. What is striking is how closely these descriptions align with modern scientific concerns, even if the language differs. Polar ice loss, changes in ocean currents, tectonic stress, and sea level rise are no longer speculative. They are monitored realities. Cayce's framework does not replace science. It contextualizes it, suggesting that what instruments measure physically may be driven by deeper systemic imbalance. Yet his message did not end with maps of disruption. He warned against becoming obsessed with geography. People, he said, would fixate on where to go, which regions to flee, how to escape change. This fixation missed the point. There were, he acknowledged, areas of relative stability. He pointed to the interior of North America, regions anchored by ancient bedrock. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, parts of Canada. Places less prone to sudden tectonic shift. But even these were not guarantees. Cayce was explicit. No place would be untouched. Stability was relative, not absolute. The idea of a permanent refuge was an illusion. This is where his message turns inward. The true danger, he believed, was not the earth changing, but humanity responding with fear. Fear, in his framework, was not just emotional, it was energetic. It amplified chaos. It narrowed perception. It locked individuals into reactive patterns that made guidance harder to access. Cayce spoke of guidance often. He described subtle redirections that occurred when individuals lived in alignment with higher principles. Missed flights, sudden changes of plan, intuitive nudges that seemed insignificant at the time but proved protective later. These were not miracles. They were the natural result of resonance. The Earth changes then were not a test of survival skills. They were a test of consciousness. Could humanity shift from domination to cooperation? From extraction to stewardship? From fear-driven reaction to awareness-driven response? This is why Cayce's warnings feel less like predictions and more like mirrors. They reflect back the consequences of choices already made, while leaving space, however narrow, for adjustment. The Earth, in this view, is not ending. It is speaking, and how humanity responds will determine not whether change happens, but how violently it unfolds. By the time Cayce finished describing these processes, he left listeners with an uncomfortable realization. The planet's instability was not separate from human instability. They were expressions of the same imbalance, manifesting at different scales. And if that is true, then the final question is not where the Earth will change next, but who will be able to move through that change without losing themselves in it. When people hear about Earth changes, maps, and collapsing coastlines, the instinctive question is always the same. Where is safe? Edgar Cayce understood this reaction, and he challenged it directly. He warned that the search for a perfect refuge often becomes another form of fear, a way of outsourcing responsibility to geography instead of consciousness. In his view, no place on Earth was meant to function as an escape hatch from transformation. Yes, he spoke of regions that would experience less immediate disruption. Areas anchored by ancient rock, far from fault lines and rising seas, would remain more stable during periods of rapid adjustment. He mentioned the interior of North America, parts of Canada, and other landlocked regions as places where rebuilding and food production would become possible as coastlines reshaped. But he never framed these areas as sanctuaries. They were stages, not shelters. The deeper message was always internal. Cayce believed that the true dividing line of the coming period would not be between nations or continents, but between states of awareness. Those anchored in fear would experience the earth changes as catastrophe. Those anchored in alignment would experience them as passage. This is where his most controversial idea emerges. Cayce suggested that many of the souls alive during this era were not random participants in history. He believed they were volunteers, individuals who had lived through earlier cycles of rise and collapse, particularly during the time of Atlantis, and had chosen to return for what he described as a final lesson. In Atlantis, according to Cayce, advanced knowledge was paired with moral failure. Power was pursued without restraint. Technology outpaced wisdom. The result was self-destruction, not imposed from outside, but generated from within. The lesson was never fully integrated. And so the story repeated, slowly, across millennia. Modern civilization, with its artificial intelligence, nuclear capability, and global interconnection, mirrors that ancient pattern closely enough to trigger recognition at a soul level. Cayce believed this recognition is why so many people feel drawn to ideas of awakening, transition, and purpose, even if they cannot articulate why. Something in them remembers. From this perspective, 2026 is not an endpoint. It is a threshold of accountability, a moment when the consequences of collective choices become visible enough that denial is no longer sustainable. This does not mean destruction is guaranteed. It means the margin for unconscious living has narrowed. Cayce was clear about one thing. Fear accelerates collapse. Panic fractures communities. Hoarding isolates individuals. Violence multiplies suffering. None of these responses help humanity navigate transformation. They lock people into survival mode, severing the intuitive guidance that becomes most important during periods of instability. Alignment, by contrast, does not mean withdrawal from the world. It means engaging with it differently, living with integrity, reducing harm, acting as a stabilizing presence rather than a reactive one. Cayce believed that individuals who cultivated this state would find themselves subtly protected, not by walls or weapons, but by timing, intuition, and connection. He spoke of moments when people would look back and realize how close they came to danger without ever knowing it. A delayed trip, a sudden change of residence, an unexpected opportunity that moved them away from instability just in time. These were not accidents. They were expressions of resonance between individual consciousness and a larger intelligence at work. As the Earth sheds old structures, it requires gardeners, not conquerors. People willing to hold clarity while systems dissolve. Willing to rebuild without repeating the same mistakes. This is the role Cayce implied for those who feel called rather than terrified by the coming changes. The final image he left was not one of collapse, but of emergence. Beneath the sands of Giza, he said, lies the Hall of Records, an archive of lost knowledge from Atlantis and earlier civilizations, preserved to be revealed when humanity was ready to understand it without misuse. He believed its discovery would coincide with this period of transformation, not as a reward, but as a reminder of where humanity has been, of what it has done before, and of what it must choose differently this time. As you reach the end of this journey, allow the urgency to soften into perspective. The Earth is not ending. It is changing. And change, while uncomfortable, is the engine of growth. You are not here to witness the end of the world. You are here to participate in the birth of a new one. Take a breath. Feel your feet on the ground beneath you. Notice the quiet stability that still exists, even amid uncertainty. Cayce believed that those who could remain grounded, aware, and compassionate during this transition would help anchor the world through it. If you feel called to this message, trust that feeling. It does not ask for belief. It asks for presence, for responsibility, for the courage to live consciously at a moment when consciousness itself may be humanity's most valuable resource. The map is changing. The story is turning, but the future is not fixed. It is listening, and so are you.